I couldn't give them grandchildren, so my parents conned VY and said my husband to leave me. They were shocked when I had a baby girl 3 years later. So I, Amelia 30F, recently ran into my parents and ex-husband, James 33M, and I'm not sure how I feel about the encounter. For reference, my parents and I have not spoken in almost 3 years, and neither has my ex-husband. We split 3 years ago and have not communicated since. In fact, I've done all in my power to avoid seeing them again because they devastated my life and mental health while I was still with them, to the point that I felt like I didn't deserve to exist. After my divorce, I moved to the suburbs and sought to create a different life for myself, away from everyone and everything associated with my past. So running into them recently was a great surprise. I said some things to them that I'm not sure were the best move for me. My parents had always desired a boy. It's not that they mistreated me growing up, but it was clear to me that they would have treated me differently if I had been a boy. My mother had even mentioned it on multiple occasions, and I had tried my hardest to be the son they never had, but I was unable to achieve it. After graduating from college and MOVYing out, I tried to stay in touch with my parents because no matter what, they were still my family, and the only family I had. I wasn't really close to my grandparents, and I didn't have any uncles or aunts who would look after me, so I accepted my fate. No matter how much they pushed me away, they were still my only family, and even if they did not appear to be interested in staying in touch with me, I attempted to retain contact. When I was about 23 years old, I began dating James. We met at a concert and had an instant connection. After 6 months of dating, I introduced him to my parents, and they began to make more of an attempt to communicate with me. They would call me more frequently, inquire about my relationship, and generally show more interest in my life. I had noticed the difference, but because it was welcome, I didn't give it much thought and simply accepted it. The longer I dated James, the more involved my parents were in my life. At one point, it seemed like we were all one big happy family. I was overjoyed since it was everything I had ever desired, so I didn't question it, even though I should have. After a little more than 2 years of dating, we became engaged and married after 3 years together. After we married, things were going well for a time, and I was enjoying my life as a newlywed. However, 6 months after my wedding, my parents began hinting that they wanted a grandchild. I was only 26 at the time, and I wasn't quite prepared. I wanted to wait a few more years before trying for a kid, but at their suggestion, I spoke with James, who was all for the notion of establishing a family. Because of his eagerness, we decided to begin trying for a baby immediately after our wedding. We tried for a long time, but after several months, we were still unable to conceive. We began to suspect that anything was wrong and opted to be tested. Unfortunately, I found out that I was infertile. It was a great shock for both of us, but my parents were even more disappointed, and they didn't even try to hide it. My father went away instead of comforting me. When we told both of our parents, we decided to stop trying for a while, and James and I spoke about attempting other methods, such as IVF. However, this would be extremely costly, and success on our first effort was not certain. So we had to postpone our plans to raise a family until we had saved enough money to cover multiple rounds of IVF. We were satisfied with that, despite our initial disappointment. However, my parents were really dissatisfied. They stopped VY citing and talking to me, and no matter how much I tried to explain that this wasn't all my fault, they weren't ready to listen. After a few weeks, I was so disappointed by their actions that I called them. I told them they had been treating me unfairly since I couldn't give them a grandchild right now, which made me wonder if they were really capable of being decent grandparents when I did have a child. I informed them that they had always treated me cruelly because I was not a boy, and I saw how differently they treated my spouse. For a long time, I attempted to ignore it and keep our friendship going, but now I'm not interested in keeping in touch with them and would rather that they stay away from me forever. It was difficult for me to express that since for so long all I wanted was their acceptance, but now I recognize that it was nearly impossible. Instead of apologizing, they escalated their actions and were happy with me not speaking to them again. They told me I was worthless as a woman since I couldn't have children, and they wanted nothing to do with me. It was painful to hear them say that, but at least I knew where I stood with them. After that phone call, I did not talk with my parents again, and we were done. When I told James about the phone call, he was sympathetic at first, but after a few days, I saw that his attitude toward me was shifting. I ignored it at first because I was already going through a difficult time mentally, and I didn't want to accept that my spouse might leave me. So I started pretending that nothing was going on and that everything was fine. Within a few months, he had changed entirely and was constantly chilly to me. I tried everything I could to save our relationship, but nothing worked. 3 months later, he returned home with the divorce papers and announced that he was done with me. I couldn't say I was startled, but I did try to reason with him. I told him we could always try for a kid later, but he stated he had a lot of reasons to leave and didn't want to talk about it. He wanted it to end as quickly as possible because it was difficult for both of us. The divorce took nearly 7 months to finalize, and they were the most difficult months of my life. I was absolutely alone, and I had broken down. To make matters worse, a few weeks after he informed me that he wanted a divorce and had moved out, I learned from a few relatives that James was supposedly levying with my parents. I knew talking to them wouldn't help, so I decided to speak with my in-laws about it. It was an unpleasant chat, but they informed me that my parents had been in contact with James for several months. I suppose they had been brainwashing him into levying me, which is why James decided to leave. Even though my in-laws thought it was a bad idea, he had argued with them and stopped speaking to them. I'm not sure what they told James, but my in-laws informed me that James implied my parents had said he deserved better, so I'm still not sure what they told him, but I think they were just desperate to have a son in any way possible. Since I was no longer speaking to them, and they couldn't hope for a grandchild from me, they quickly decided to take James under their wing and get him to leave me. My divorce left me extremely damaged, and it took me several months to get back on my feet, but I did it. Since then, I have not looked back and have done everything in my ability to forget the past and go forward. After my divorce, I moved to the suburbs. I started a new job, changed my appearance, and blocked my parents and James on social media. I also told all of my former friends and relatives that I never wanted to hear anything about them again, and I didn't want them to know anything about me. Everyone respected it. For the past 3 years, I've been in treatment and doing well. The only thing that bothered me was the absence of a baby. I still desired a child, despite the fact that I no longer had a husband or parents. I felt like I was ready to become a mother. Last year, I began IVF procedures and became pregnant with the help of an anonymous donor. 4 months later, I gave birth to my beautiful girl. Life has been very good since she was born, and I'm very pleased. 4 days ago, I was walking down the street with her when I ran into my folks and James. I was astonished to find them on my street. I believed they had come to visit me, but then I noticed they were stepping out of a residence a few blocks away. When they saw me, I froze. I should have returned home, but I simply couldn't bring myself to do so. They approached me, greeted me, and immediately inquired about the baby, as they were aware that I was infertile. I responded truthfully, and by that point, I had comprehended what was going on and began walking back home. But James stopped me and said he was delighted he ran into me because he had been thinking a lot about me lately. They had apparently come to visit his aunt, who had recently moved into the neighborhood, and he took bumping into me as a message from the cosmos that he should make things right and give our relationship another opportunity. My parents were also standing there, and they demanded that I invite them home to talk about all that has been going on in my life, as they had clearly missed out on a lot. I was shocked that they were even suggesting this, let alone that they expected me to allow them in after everything that had transpired in the past. It took me 3 years to move on from everything, and I'm still in therapy trying to work through my emotions, so I had an outburst. I told them I'd rather have a lot of murderous wild animals in my house than them, since they'd still be better. I told them to quit acting like they cared about me or what was going on in my life, since the only reason they wanted to talk to me now was that I had a baby. My parents wanted to talk to me because they were finally going to have a grandson, and James wanted to talk to me because clearly he couldn't find anyone else. He assumed that because I had previously been able to conceive, getting pregnant again would be easy, and he could just return to my life. It was sickening that they only regarded me as a supply of babies, not a human person with real emotions. They had all abandoned me when I most needed their emotional support, even though I had expected this from my parents, who had made it plain throughout my upbringing that they would have chosen a boy. It was nonetheless shocking. They believed that a woman's worth was determined by her ability to be a mother. The big surprise, though, was James. He had spent so many years with me and soothed me, but he had still gone along with whatever my parents suggested for some strange reason and abandoned me when I was at my lowest point. I hadn't forgotten anything they'd said to me, so I just repeated everything back to them. Since I was worthless as a woman and James deserved better, perhaps they should leave me alone now. I've always been a quiet and shy person, but when they confronted me on the street that day, I yelled at them from the top of my lungs. It was the culmination of 3 years' worth of rage, so it was quite unpleasant. After I finished ranting at them, I dashed back to my house and closed the door as quickly as possible. I was feeling quite bad after that, so I opted not to go to work for a few days and have stayed at home with my baby ever since. Since then, my interactions with my parents and James have played over and over in my mind. I honestly had no idea what I was going to do about it until last evening, when I got a call from an unknown number. I'm not sure why, but I decided to answer the phone. Yesterday, normally, I don't answer calls from unknown numbers. It was James on the other phone, and I could hear my folks whispering in the background. I'm very sure they weren't attempting to be quiet. They just wanted me to know they were there. Anyway, I tried not to be too impacted by it. I just informed him that I did not want him to phone me again because otherwise I would have to take preventive measures against him, which I did not want to do. I reminded him that the same thing applied to my parents. I didn't want anything to do with them, and the only reason I answered the phone was to inform them that I was done. I had finished 3 years ago and was still clinging to it. But James told me to hear him out, and I couldn't bring myself to hang up, so I let him speak. He admitted to me that he, like my parents, had made mistakes, but it was out of disappointment. He mentioned that both my parents and he were looking forward to beginning a family, having a baby, and so on. They struggled to accept the fact that I was infertile and hesitant to do IVF until we had saved enough money. They hadn't handled it well, but they wanted another chance to prove they were worthy of being in my life. After a few seconds, I informed him I didn't want any of the rubbish they were selling me. They wouldn't have cared about me if they hadn't seen me carrying a kid that day, and that was the bottom line. That was the truth, and I was sick of them pretending otherwise. I was about to hang up when my parents spoke out from the background, saying that this was exactly the type of behavior or that had caused them to cut me off in the first place. Apparently, they thought I was selfish and just concerned with myself when I discovered I was infertile. They said that instead of giving everyone their space, I constantly forced my presence on them and tried to get them to comfort me and pay attention to me, despite the fact that they were dealing with the news themselves. That, they explained, was why everyone had pushed me away, leaving me with no one to turn to. I didn't continue the conversation after that. I simply hung up. I know they were just attempting to dupe me, but I can't help but question myself now. So, for my own peace of mind, I need to ask, am I to blame since I sought reassurance after learning that I was infertile? First and foremost, many people questioned why my parents had not tried for another child after I was born, especially because they desired a boy so much. My mother experienced a lot of issues with her first pregnancy, so the doctors said her to wait a few years before trying again. But even when my mother had me, she was in her mid-30s. Waiting a few more years would have put my mother in her late 30s, making the pregnancy considerably riskier. My mother had a tough time conceiving me just as I had battled and eventually discovered I was infertile. The only difference was that while she was struggling, her mother-in-law was rude to her. But this time it was my own mother who couldn't stop thinking about how I felt anyway. That was the reason they couldn't have another kid and were left with only me, a girl. I'm not sure what kind of relationship James had with his parents, but from what I saw, they seemed to get along nicely as of now. I'm not sure if they've been able to reconcile following their recent fallout because I haven't contacted his parents and obviously haven't spoken with James about it. James is an only kid, so he didn't face any competition. When I cited his parents, I could tell they loved him and had treated him well since boyhood. So I'm not sure why he became so attached to my parents. At least with my parents, I knew they wanted a son, which explains why they started treating James that way. But with James, I'm not sure what went wrong. I've spent the last 3 years trying to forget about everything, so I hadn't given it any attention or questioned it. But now that you've brought it up, I feel compelled to speak with my ex-in-laws to get to the bottom of it, if only for my own curiosity. Anyway, I hope this answers any questions. Update 1. I decided to speak with my ex-in-laws to find out why James has been acting the way he has. To be honest, I couldn't think of a single reason why he needed to go sit his aunt with my parents. It was simply bizarre. I already knew it wasn't my fault they had deserted me when I needed them because they are bad people, and I knew they were only attempting to gaslight me. I just wanted reassurance and didn't want to bother my friends with it because it was too personal, so I shared it here. So thank you to everyone who informed me that I wasn't the terrible guy here. It was weird reaching out to them after 3 years of no communication, especially because the last time I spoke with them was around the time of the divorce. Fortunately, they were pleased to hear from me. After some small conversation, I came right to the issue and inquired why James was so close to my parents and if they had contacted him. They told me that a few months after their last battle, they had reconciled with James and were now in contact with him. However, he had kept in touch with my parents. They clarified that James was adored as a youngster, so he wasn't attempting to replace his parents with mine. However, my parents had been suspicious since the start of our relationship. Even when we were dating, they attempted to persuade him to join them. James had informed his parents that my parents would periodically invite him to supper even when I was busy, and that he would accompany them alone. He thought this was something to brag about because he believed he had impressed my parents simply by being himself, which was partially correct. Being a guy was enough to impress them. They had already spent a lot of one-on-one time together without my knowledge, and James had begun to look up to them as parental figures, despite the fact that he had his own parents who he respected. It was very complicated. On top of that, my parents were continually showering him with expensive presents and writing him checks. That was the money James offered to use for IVF while we were together, but I assumed he was joking because we didn't have that much money. I never wanted him to do anything dirty for money, and he didn't want to tell me that he had gotten a large sum of money from my parents since it would have forced him to reveal the nature of his relationship with them. Even after that, I declined to go with IVF because I did not believe he had the funds, and I wanted to save. My parents used that to persuade him to oppose me, claiming he deserved better, someone who believed in him. Within a few months, they were able to brainwash him, and he eventually left me. My ex-in-laws apologized to me but said that while they disagreed with James's relationship with my parents, he was their only son, and they couldn't cut him off either. I don't blame them. They owe me nothing, and they were only being helpful by speaking the truth. Now that I know the reality, I see no need to entertain any of them. If they contact me, they're all horrible people that don't deserve my attention. Update 2. I finally decided to return to work after nearly 2 weeks off. Fortunately, I have plenty of maternity time left because I did not take the entire 6 months off in one go, and my company's policy is flexible. While I was at work, just my daughter and her babysitter remained at home. I trust the nanny totally because she has excellent recommendations, and I know her personally. She's an excellent woman. She called me about halfway through the workday. She quickly informed me that she had moved my kid to her own home since she was unsure whether staying at my place was safe, given my ex-husband's conduct. I consented and let her take my daughter home, guaranteeing their safety, and then contacted the cops as I drove home. On the phone, she told me that James had been outside for a few minutes yelling for me to come out. When he learned I wasn't home, he attempted to kick down the door. He was cursing loudly, and my daughter was sobbing, so my nanny called me right away so I could notify the police. She exited through the back door and strolled to her home via the backyard gate, as she lived only a few minutes away. That way, my baby could be safe while I dealt with my ex-husband and the cops. To be honest, compliments to her. Her primary goal was my child's safety and well-being, which was appropriate. When I got home, the cops had already arrived, and it was clear Scott had been drinking. It seemed strange because it was only around midday, yet there he was, inebriated. I decided to file charges against him because he had really ticked me off, and I wanted him out of my life. This also offered me the opportunity to get a restraining order against him, since he was plainly losing control. The authorities took him away, and a few minutes later, my nanny returned with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off because I planned to stay at home with my child. I'll probably have to take a few more days off from work, but I'm not complaining because I get to spend more time with my favorite person. Update 3. It's been a few weeks since my pre-VYS post. I've been busy caring for my baby and decided to embark on a new project, which has been exciting. Regarding the situation between my parents and James, I was able to obtain a restraining order against him. Fortunately, it wasn't too difficult because I had surveillance tape from the day he showed up intoxicated and started throwing a fuss when he learned I wasn't home. I suppose my parents looked at his condition and decided not to bother me anymore, so they've been staying away. My ex-in-laws informed me that following what happened, they have decided to cut relations with James as well. Apparently, he's having trouble locating other ladies despite his desire to start a family. He can't do it without a partner, and he dislikes the thought of adopting, which may explain why he acted out the other day, but it doesn't mean I have to forgive him, especially given everything he's put me through. My parents are still attempting to badmouth me to my relatives, which is unfortunate because it isn't working. Everyone knows they did the worst thing to me, and now they're pretending they're the VY Tims. That's not how it works, and they're finding out the hard way. I'm delighted they won't have any relationship with their grandchild. I won't allow it. My kid and I will have a lovely life together without anyone troubling us, and I'm determined to be a far better parent than the ones I had as an example. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.